Story 1. I've been meaning to share this story for quite some time now. A few years back, on a road trip from Pennsylvania to Arizona, my two friends and I braved a 35-hour drive with no hotel stops along the way. My friend was driving, another friend sat in the passenger seat, and I was in the back seat. We took turns at the wheel, and after nearly 2 days of non-stop driving with minimal breaks for food and fuel, we finally crossed the state line into Arizona. It was around 1 a.m. and our gas was running low. The only gas station we found listed as open online was about 3 miles inside the Petrified Forest National Park. With no other options, we decided to check it out. As soon as we entered the park, we couldn't help but wonder how there could be an open gas station here. It was pitch black, no other cars in sight, and the park appeared deserted. The only source of light during our 3-mile drive to our destination was our headlights. Miraculously, we arrived at a gas station hidden within the park. There was no attendant and the store was locked, but the gas pump had a light on. Our friend pulled over. It was a tight squeeze at this small gas station. My friends joked that I should pump the gas because I was the only guy in the car. In truth, none of us wanted to step outside. The atmosphere was giving us the creeps. But I got out, swiped my card at the pump, and started filling up the tank. As I began fueling up, we noticed distant lights approaching. I want to emphasize that there had been no lights other than our headlights and the faint glow of the gas pump at the station. The night was pitch black for miles within the park. We hadn't seen any other vehicles on the road during our drive in. Where are these lights coming from? I said to my friends through the window. Must be a park ranger. I realized I was saying it more to reassure myself than because I was hoping it was true. The lights drew nearer, blinding us as they pulled into the station with their high beams on, shining directly at me. Eventually, we could make out the vehicle. It was a random RV, not a park ranger. I could see a man in the front seat, a skinny white guy with a mustache wearing glasses and a baseball cap, as far as I could tell. There was no one else in the RV with him. I assumed he was in the same situation as us, running low on fuel with no other option but to fill up at the park. However, he drove around the gas pump and positioned his RV facing us for an unknown reason. At this point, I could see his eyes. We were so close that I could clearly see the driver while I continued to fill up the tank. He smiled at me as he slowly edged his vehicle closer to ours as if he were trying to provoke us. He continued to approach, getting closer, and we wondered why he wasn't stopping. He was about to hit us while we were immobilized, driving at less than 5 miles per hour. So my friend in the passenger seat finally mustered the courage to reach over and honk the horn to signal him to stop. The sound of that horn, piercing the absolute silence of the night, will haunt me forever. At that moment, I wasn't just looking at the RV, I was also looking through the window at my friends. Without words, we were all expressing our extreme fear and confusion at the haunting situation. The RV finally stopped just a few yards from our car, and the man waved at me again, almost apologetically, still smiling. Although we weren't fully fueled and no longer felt comfortable standing at the pump, so I hung it up and quickly got back in the car. I didn't even have to say, "Let's get out of here." As soon as I closed the door, my friend started the car. At this point, the RV had positioned itself so that we couldn't drive straight out of the station. It was blocking our way forward. Our only option was to reverse into the forest, the unpaved, non-drivable forest, and then angle our way out from there. We managed to do it while the RV driver just sat there staring at us, not attempting to leave his vehicle or refuel. We got out, drove as fast as we could in that narrow path out of the park, and kept checking behind us to see if we were being followed. We weren't. It seemed like the RV turned off its headlights as soon as we left. We didn't discuss what had happened until we were absolutely certain we were safe and back on the highway. When we finally talked about it, we realized that the RV had been lurking in the dark of the forest with its lights off, waiting for someone to approach the pump. Otherwise, we would have seen the headlights, as the darkness was too thick to miss them. We have no idea what might have happened if we hadn't honked the horn, or if we had let him slowly approach and hit our car. Would he have suggested, "Sorry, let's all step out of the car and check for damage," and then tried something? Would he have lured us out in the open, leaving us without the protection of the car? Was he alone in the RV? We will never know, and I'm relieved that we didn't stick around to find out. Story 2. I was around 20 at the time. Back home from college for a visit. My friend Ian and I were enjoying a few drinks and spending time with 2 girls we knew from high school. As 2 aspiring romantics who weren't quite old enough to go to the bar, we decided to have our drinks at a secluded beach we were familiar with. To reach this particular beach, we had to walk through a densely wooded area, and even though it was dark, everyone seemed comfortable with the idea. We set out on our journey, a path we'd taken without incident on several occasions. However, this time, we immediately sensed that something was off. There were no frogs or bugs, and the forest was eerily silent, shrouded in a profound stillness. Ian and I exchanged quiet words, suggesting that such silence might indicate the presence of a predator. But by that point, a few drinks in, we convinced ourselves that we were probably the scariest things in that forest. We proceeded down the path, maintaining a heightened level of alertness. Then, we noticed an unusual smell. The forest had a strange odor, almost like a blend of musty clothes and unpleasant breath. Again, we felt concerned, but since we were almost there, we saw no reason to turn back. The final stretch of the path led us through a marshy lowland that connected the barrier island to the mainland. It was undeniably creepy, with old, twisted trees casting eerie shadows over the path. The little moonlight we had was gradually blocked out by the tangled web of branches. As we walked halfway through this path, I heard a distinct mechanical click, like the sound of a Snapple bottle cap being popped. Ian and I froze, and before we could pinpoint the source of the noise, we heard it again from a different direction. After a brief pause, the forest seemed to come to life. A dozen figures, vaguely silhouetted by the moonlight, stood up and started moving towards us from all directions. Without hesitation, Ian bolted in a full sprint. I initially intended to follow, but I hesitated, realizing I couldn't leave the girls alone to face potential danger. As they grasped the situation, they began to scream with a kind of terror only experienced when you believe it's all over. I positioned them to run, but as I turned around, the path was blocked by obscure figures. It was a hopeless situation, with no way out, and we were vastly outnumbered by beings that didn't even appear human. I kept the girls behind me and prepared for a final stand. I was terrified, but the adrenaline rush helped me remain composed. The figure closest to us suddenly stopped in its advance. An arm emerged from its center and removed a helmet strapped with foliage, revealing a man's painted face. He began to speak, and I stood before him in disbelief. He identified himself as a Marine Corps officer and explained that they sometimes conducted military exercises in the stretch of land, which I learned was public access but owned by the Navy. They had been uncertain if we were part of the exercise, which explained their approach. He apologized, but at that point, I was simply happy to be alive. As they escorted us back, the strange occurrences in the woods began to make sense. The silence, the peculiar smell, and those clicks were all a result of a platoon of Marines moving stealthily in the shadows. On our way back, several smaller groups that had remained in concealment made themselves known, including one that had prevented Ian from running all the way back to Baltimore. Needless to say, the journey back home was awkward, and the girls were not pleased with Ian's reaction, which, with the unintentional assistance of the Marine Corps, had left them traumatized. Until that officer removed his helmet, I truly believed we were in the midst of a horror movie. Story 3. I've served as a cop for 12 years. This story comes back to perhaps my second or third year in the force. We received a call about a missing child during a local Halloween festival at a church. My partner and I decided to investigate the surrounding neighborhood, as there were already plenty of officers at the festival grounds. It was the beginning of the graveyard shift, around 9:30 to 10 p.m. While checking the neighborhood, I noticed a rundown house that had a makeshift blanket for a front door. An orange glow emanated from inside, catching my attention. This place looked more like a small shack than a proper house. My partner and I decided to enter to ensure the child hadn't wandered inside. We announced our presence, but there was no response. Given the lack of a front door and our primary concern being the girl's safety, we went inside the shack. As soon as we stepped inside, it became evident that the house had no electricity. The eerie glow was the result of numerous glass candles illuminating every room and hallway. While we searched from room to room for the child, the continuous crunching underfoot was unnerving. The entire time we spent there felt like we had crossed into another dimension. There was an unsettling, surreal aura, palpable and stomach-churning. We both felt like intruders in a place we shouldn't be. It was frightening. However, we found nothing but empty rooms filled with candles. It was only when I pointed my flashlight at the floor that we discovered the crunching sound was thousands of cockroaches crawling all over. The floor seemed to teem with these insects, making it appear as if the ground itself was alive. My partner and I exchanged glances and decided to leave immediately. We continued our search in the rest of the neighborhood until we received a radio message from officers at the festival that the missing girl had been found. Later that night, as my shift ended and I reflected on the day and night's events, the whole incident continued to trouble me. There was something profoundly unsettling about that place in the shack. The sheer number of roaches in the ground was something straight out of a horror movie. The experience felt surreal and deeply unsettling. The following day, I returned to the neighborhood during daylight, but I couldn't find the shack anywhere. It was as if it had never existed. I asked my partner if he felt similarly, and told me that he also tried to locate the place but came up empty. He confided that the entire experience had kept him awake, unable to sleep. To this day, it's probably the closest thing to the paranormal or unexplainable that I've encountered in my career. It still haunts me. Story 4. This past September, my family and I went on vacation to a small island in North Carolina. We had visited and stayed on this island many times throughout my childhood and teen years, so I was very familiar with it and was excited to be back after having not been there for over a decade. One night, my family and I were hanging out on the back porch, enjoying some drinks and having a late-night conversation. Just as everyone was finishing up and preparing to turn in for the night, I happened to step outside and noticed the breathtaking sight of the stars. I live in the suburbs outside of a big city, where I can usually spot about 20 stars on a clear night, but on this island, the entire sky was filled with stars. I called my sister and we both stood in awe as everyone else headed to bed. That's when we decided we wanted to grab our bikes and go for a midnight ride. I'm 28, my sister is 36, but there was something about sneaking out of the house without informing anyone that made us both feel like teenagers once more. We pedaled off into the midnight, laughing and gazing up at the stars. Eventually, we decided to stop at the opposite end of the island, just to soak in the view and have a conversation. The island was peaceful and silent. With the clock approaching 4 a.m., we hadn't encountered a single person during our journey. We eventually made the decision to start our ride back. We weren't chatting as much at this point, focusing on a return trip. As we approached a bend in the road getting closer to our house, I spotted a man standing ahead under the only streetlight in the road. Without even having time to process what I was seeing, he began walking towards the center of the road and stopped right in our path, gazing at us as we approached. My sister was slightly ahead of me, so I attempted to alert her without being too loud, but her response was, "Huh? I don't see anyone." I kept my eyes on her, pedaling closer, my heart racing. I repeated myself, this time more urgently, but she still didn't seem to grasp my fear. I yelled at her, and finally she stopped. We were about 20 feet away from the man on the road, and I told my sister how uneasy he made me and that I didn't know what to do. That's when I saw him slowly walk back towards the side of the road and vanish from our view. In a state of panic, I made a quick decision to pedal as fast as I could past this man and get back home. However, as I passed the spot in the road where he had been, I looked over and there was no one there. I still have no idea where he could have gone. We made it home safely, and it has become a rather strange story to share with people. But to this day, I still have no clue about what that man was doing or what his intentions might have been on that deserted island at 4 a.m. That was a close one. They're lucky they got out of there fast. Have you ever experienced something so scary that you thought you'd be dead by daylight? Trust me, you're not alone. Like and subscribe to my channel now for more scary stories that will keep you up at night. Story 5. One evening, I was driving from the local airport with my future wife, who happened to be a pilot. It was around 9 p.m. Our route took us past a pull-off area where some county dumpers were located. As we passed by, a car with its lights off that had been parked there suddenly drove out on the gravel road and got right behind my vehicle, following the speed limit. He followed so closely in my rearview mirror that I could only make out the tint in his windshield, not even the hood of his car. It wasn't a police vehicle, but rather an early 2000s Chevy. The scary part was that he was clearly tailing us. Initially, I made a series of seemingly random turns using my blinker, thinking that perhaps he was just coincidentally going in the same direction and wanted me to speed up on the single-lane road with a double yellow line. However, after about 3 turns that continued to keep him close, I realized this wasn't random at all. I told my wife to grab onto something, then abruptly, I turned onto a side road with my blinker indicating a different direction. I sped down a road with a much slower speed limit at around 90 miles per hour, taking a few extra turns until we reached the airport parking lot. I turned off my lights and we waited. Sure enough, the same car came racing down the road I had just been on, driving aggressively. We watched as he disappeared around a bend out of sight. I wasted no time and quickly drove in the opposite direction with my lights off, relying on the moonlight to guide us. Once I neared a main road, I flicked the lights back on and continued home while keeping to the speed limit. The entire thing left us both deeply unnerved. We considered calling the police and even thought about parking at the police station, hoping the cops would be able to pull him over immediately. We had no idea what his intentions were. We didn't want to take any chances. Story 6. I woke up in a coma in the hospital, finding myself entirely paralyzed, with my vocal cords damaged to the point where I couldn't utter a word. The agony was unbearable. They had me on ketamine and no one had informed me of the side effects, leaving me really frightened as to why I was experiencing vivid hallucinations. During that time, I witnessed some truly nightmarish scenes. I was convinced that I was strapped to the bed in some illegal human experimentation facility. The nurses appeared drenched in red while the doctors concealed their faces behind masks, shouting at the top of their lungs. I cried hard, desperately attempting to tell them not to harm me, yet my voice failed me. This went on for a week until they removed me from the ketamine. It's been 12 long years and I still endure haunting nightmares. I've resolved never to dabble in hallucinogenic substances again, as I've learned that they can trigger flashbacks to horrifying experiences while under the influence. I'm determined never to revisit the dark place. Each time I fall ill, I tremble at the thought of slipping into another coma, and I'm scared to call an ambulance even in the direst circumstances. Back then, I truly believed I was trapped in a horror movie. It was really terrifying. Story 7. I was babysitting and the children were fast asleep upstairs. The only light in the house came from the 3 table lamps in the living room, where I was working on my homework. Then the phone rang. This was the 80s, so I picked up the landline. After I answered, I heard the dial tone, but the phone continued to ring persistently. I tried to fiddle with the phone and it eventually stopped ringing, but the dial tone remained. This happened twice, but I decided to continue with my homework. Suddenly, all 3 table lamps went dark, and no matter how hard I tried, they wouldn't turn back on. There was no overhead light in the room, plunging the entire house into total darkness. Then a deafening noise came from the far side of the house, reminding me of a dying furnace or a captive wild animal. I sprinted upstairs and turned on the hallway light. I stayed in the hallway, right outside the children's bedrooms, trembling with fear until the parents arrived. I was too frightened to go to the kitchen to use the single phone to call for help. Upon their return, the parents offered an explanation for everything. They had a dual-line phone with a tiny switch on its side. If I'd flipped it, I would have been able to answer the ringing line. All the table lamps in the living room were equipped with timers, set to turn off in the evening to conserve electricity. The unsettling noise was simply their hot water radiator heating system. Apparently, the pipes produced that sound when the system was initiated. I told them to inform future babysitters about these things. That freaked me out. I was almost convinced that the house was cursed, like a crossover of When a Stranger Calls and Poltergeist. Story 8. My wife and I had checked into a hotel room and had settled into bed. My wife was already asleep and I was on the verge of drifting off when I heard a faint voice in the room, barely above a whisper, saying, "I think they were asleep now. Believing I had just heard the voice of someone hiding in a room, I leaped out of the bed in terror. I switched on all the lights and searched the bathroom, shower, under the bed, and the closet, but to my surprise, there was no one else present. My wife and I were the sole occupants of the room. While some might attribute it to a haunted room, what I encountered was a hypnagogic hallucination. Nonetheless, for those few minutes, I was truly petrified. Story 9. I was dating a girl in my early 20s and we went on a road trip to California. However, during our journey, she began to display symptoms of a troubling condition. Throughout the day, she'd be perfectly normal, but then, out of nowhere, her aura would suddenly change. One night, we found ourselves alone in a small building on a farm while doing a work trade. She was having a casual conversation with me, but suddenly, she froze. Her gaze fixed past me, her face contorted with terror. "It's right behind you." That sent chills down my spine. I was terrified. I glanced behind me, but there was nothing there. I asked her what she had seen, but she couldn't explain. Instead, she began saying bad things about herself and descending further into a negative spiral of thoughts. What was even more unsettling was the way her pupils dilated instantly, as though she'd just received eye drops. Then I noticed her reaching for a knife on the side table. Swiftly, I grabbed her wrist and pinned her down to the ground. Eventually, I managed to disarm her without her being able to harm herself or anyone else. The craziest part was the extraordinary strength she had. Despite having a weight advantage of about 60 pounds over this 110-pound girl, she managed to put up a fight while trying to keep the knife. Story 10. Back in 6th grade on a school camping trip, I shared a tent with 2 other girls. One early morning when it was still a bit dark outside, I woke up to shouting. I opened my eyes and saw a young man leaning over me, glancing back at the tent entrance. Before I could fully understand what was happening, he was pulled out of the tent. It turned out he had been sneaking around the tents and he had left an axe near my head. Everything happened so fast and I was still half asleep, so I didn't fully grasp the weight of the situation. And given the difficult circumstances in my life at the time, I never dwelled on the incident. It was just a memory, like saying, "Oh yeah, at that time, I might have been harmed in a tent." This story gave me serious Camp Crystal Lake vibes. I hope the cops have already caught that creep before he does something else. You've made it to the end. If you want more haunting stories, then stay tuned for the next video. Story 5 was really disturbing. See you there.